welcome. Today we're very lucky, honored, indeed, I think blessed to have Daniel Greenfield with us to talk about the Coleyville, Texas synagogue attack, where Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker and his congregants escaped from an Islamic gunman, Malik Fasil Akram, who was trying to get Afia Siddiqui out of federal prison. She's known as Lady Al-Qaeda, and she got her PhD from Brandeis University. So she's a proud alumnus of Jewish education, and Brandeis is totally responsible for her career as far as I'm concerned, and I think should take credit for that type of alumna activity. I say this as someone, my film is in the Brandeis Jewish Film Archives, but I have never been invited to speak on any topic ever at that university, which gave financial aid and a degree to Lady Al-Qaeda. In any case, getting that off my chest. Daniel is a blogger with Sultan Knish, sultanknishblogspot.com. He's a columnist for frontpagemag.com, which is published by David Horowitz Freedom Center. Full disclosure, I used to work for David Horowitz. And he's a Shulman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He writes for Front Page and the Jewish Press. His daily column in Front Page is called The Point. He's written or been published in Newsweek, Jerusalem Post, INN, JNS, that's Jewish News Service, and Town Hall. He's been quoted by Rush Limbaugh, Mark Stein, Mark Levin, Daniel Pipes, Glenn Reynolds, Lou Dobbs, and other notables, as well as National Review and Fox News. When I wrote my article about him 3 years ago for the latest, he had 250,000 references on a Google name search. I'm sure it's far more than that. He's also published by Canada Free Press and Right Size News. And I think he's probably the most influential writer about the Muslim fundamentalist terrorist threat in the United States that I know of. He's been doing it, I think, since 9/11. He wrote a book called The Great Betrayal about how President Obama was undermining the global war on terror based on his own analysis, and has since then written numerous books. I made a list. Why Israel is the Victim with David Horowitz, Students for Justice in Palestine, a hate group, 10 Reasons to Abolish the UN, The Great Betrayal, Obama's War in Iraq, which we already did, and then a book very relevant now, Muslim Hate Groups on Campus. And so I know he's been following this story closely because I read his article on Sultan Knish the other day. Texas synagogue terrorist came out of UK Islamist no-go zone, which analyzes Blackburn, the home of the Muslim community that produced a number of famous jihadists and ISIS members. He said some interesting things in that article, which is on Sultan Knish. You can read it. I'll put a link down below in the comments. But the most important thing he said to me was, we can either police our borders, control our immigration, and build walls around our nations, or we must be resigned to being hunted, stalked, and killed anywhere and at any given moment. And it seems to me what happened in Texas is an example of that very threat described in this article. And I'm now going to say it's unfortunate when prophecies are realized, but Daniel, thank you for being here. How did you come to this conclusion?
Well, actually, linked audio from the terrorist was actually released. Was published on the Jewish Chronicle site, a British Jewish paper, and then the terrorist actually says that he wants others like him to come out of the UK, to come to the US to carry out terrorist attacks here. He very clearly sees himself as a model. This is common among jihadis, And he's introducing a kind of different, slightly different way of doing things. In the past, these guys would carry out terrorist attacks in their own, the place where they actually live. Here, he's saying you can just get on a plane, you can land at JFK, you can come to America, you can carry out an attack right here. And this is obviously, he failed, he's dead, but others will follow in his footsteps, much like the early car jihad attacks had a mixed record, but he wants others to imitate him, and I think they will.
So you actually think the fact that he got killed, and I thank you, I'll put a link to that audio. You sent that to me as well. I assume you'll put it on front page as well, and Sultan Knish. He was doing this as an advertisement, sort of as a recruiting poster for jihadis to join him as martyrs. I presume the family will be paid some sort of payment. It's traditional, I believe, in that sort of system. What do you think? To me, the moment that was the moment of truth, I think the rabbi was very brave and deserves a great deal of praise and is a hero for saving the lives of his congregants and himself and helping to kill the attacker. But the moment to me that seems crucial in this whole story is the moment where the rabbi invites the attacker into the synagogue, which I presume is closed and locked, for a cup of tea, because he sees a homeless person looking pitiful on his doorstep. And yet that seemed to me an example of the very issue of immigration on a larger sense. If you invite people in who want to kill you, in the end, you're going to have to kill them. And they're going to, in the meanwhile, disrupt everything. So maybe just leave the door locked and he'll go somewhere else. What is your reaction?
I think that's exactly correct. This is a model for our society. We are very eager to have open borders to take down the boundaries that would actually protect us. You know, when it comes to Islamic terrorism, when it comes to immigration in general, when it comes to crime for that matter, there are so many complaints about the police state. We have so many police. Well, why do we have so many police? Because we've effectively dismantled the basic social guardians and boundaries against criminal behavior. And thus we need a lot of police to deal with the consequences. And likewise, we need to have this war on terror. We need to have drones. We need to have a large military because we've dismantled basic protections against just having terrorists come in here and attack us. And as a result, we need to have this military industrial complex, which we would not need to this extent. We would not need to be taking off our shoes at the airport or all the other measures of the TSA. So as a result, we've dismantled the protections in our society. Then when the consequences happen, well, of course, we need intervention, we need to use force. And of course, we are supposed to feel very guilty, very bad about this, even though, you know, it's actually the leftist, the liberal trends that have actually brought about this situation, this crisis. The very same people who are telling us to feel guilty for having police, for having a military, for having to use force, are the ones who actually created this entire state of affairs. And this is the kind of schizophrenia that we're seeing. And, you know, obviously this is very much also crystallized in this Temple siege, where on the one hand, yes, we want you to come in. We are very happy to have a homeless person come in. We're going to give you something. We're going to feel good about it. And then, of course, when it turns bad, then you need the police, you need the FBI to come down. And then, of course, now we need to talk about how we can avoid Islamophobia, how we can feel guilty about protecting ourselves from a crisis that we ourselves created.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because the word we is sort of always, to me, a loaded term, like who's we, Kima Sabi. The reaction, I watched the entire memorial, well, not memorial, healing service at the Methodist Church in Coleyville, presided over by Rabbi Citron Walker on Facebook today. And I thought it was very interesting because in one sense, it was very moving, but in another sense, and I say you're Orthodox, he's Reform. We can talk a little bit about religion here, but I've now gone to all Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox synagogues. I don't think I've been to, I think I actually went to one Reconstructionist synagogue. But the tone of it was as a healing service, and it began with a quote from Martin Luther King. It had rainbow ideology, rainbow illustrations on the board. And there were actually some Jewish prayers about God. But at the end, there was an affirmation from the rabbi, and I want to read it to you. We stand together against hatred, bigotry, and violence. We stand together in love and support for one another. We stand together in words and deeds. We stand together, understanding that our actions matter. Now, the tone of it was that there'd been some tremendous trauma and some horror, and then they need to be healed. Another interpretation, which I go to an Orthodox shul, but I wouldn't say I'm religious, would be there was a miracle in Coleyville, Texas. An Arab, well, a Pakistani terrorist, a Muslim terrorist, came to kill Jews for Allah. And instead, just like in the Purim story, he ended up dead. And we should celebrate and dance and thank God that once again, he has put his protective mantle over the Jewish people and rescued us from our enemies. That was language I didn't hear from a single speaker in the hour thing. Now, I think that's the difference between Reform and Orthodox. But my question is, who is the we who are standing together in the Reform community?
Well, I think what we are seeing here is Universalist theology, which has no really meaningful religious specificity. It's unable to really grapple with specifics, whether it's the Muslim terrorists, whether it's the experience of the hostages themselves. There is just this binary between love and hate, which is what passes for spirituality. We represent love, they represent hate. There's no understanding of geopolitics, understanding of specific motivations. Of the role anti-Semitism, for example, plays in Islamic theology. That's not something we can address. Instead, there is this larger pseudo-spiritual struggle that everybody can relate to, that everybody in a very liberal universalist framework can relate to, which is a kind of generic struggle between love and hate, which does not address what happened, obviously, nor does it address what could prevent it from happening in the future. It has no connection, obviously, to Judaism or Jewish history specifically, but then it avoids specifics, whether it's the specifics of Jewish history, of a kind of religious response you laid out, which would be the traditional Jewish religious response, or in any case, really the specific ideology of the attacker. So if you can't deal with specifics, all you can do is go back to this kind of sense of really this kind of very 60s, 70s, hippie-ish love and hate. We represent love, they represent hate. It doesn't actually say anything, but it makes the participants feel good. This is therapy. It's meant to deal with trauma rather than actually deal with what's the real threat. And this is something we see in general beyond the Jewish community, beyond the liberal Jewish community. For that matter, when it comes to liberal Christians, when it comes to the kinds of memorials we've been putting up, for that matter, for decades now, it's not the heroic war memorials. You go back 60, 70, 80 years, and you have these heroic, muscular World War I, World War II memorials filled with traditional statuary and declarations of heroism and heroic imagery. Whereas the later memorials, whether it's the Oklahoma City bombing, September 11th, a lot of this is just a lot of empty spaces, a lot of generic healing, a lot of we are processing this trauma. Whereas in the past, they would say, we have been attacked, we have to fight back. We need to mourn and we need to gain courage to attack. Postmodern, what we do is we feel pain. And this is really what this is about. We are feeling pain. We are processing our pain. We are the good people. The people who attacked us are the bad people. We don't know exactly who we are, who they are, but we are the people who are feeling and they're the people who are not feeling. And this is really how they describe love and hate.
But they actually don't specify who the haters are. I mean, in other words, all sorts of efforts were made to fuzz up the motivations of the attacker. Subsequently, the Anti-Defamation League, and indeed my own Jewish community here in Florida, which I protested, sent out letters about the dangers of anti-Semitism and so forth, without ever mentioning that this was actually an act of war by a guerrilla terrorist cell against the United States of America and the Jewish community, both. And because also Islamic fundamentalists believe the Jews run America. They're not the only ones. Right-wing anti-Semites believe the same thing. But how on earth can the Reform and establishment Jewish community be persuaded that their 1960s ideas simply are not adequate to the situation we face today. They're not appropriate, they're not helpful, and in fact, far from being the good people, by applying a false model to the situation, they're actually helping the bad people.
Well, the crisis is, as I mentioned, a crisis of theology, and it's very hard to talk people out of their theology. So the Muslim terrorist came in with his particular theology, repeatedly mentions Allah. He believed that he was a martyr for the Islamic cause, for the cause of the jihad. Traditional Jews would have seen themselves as martyrs also as part of the persecution of the Jews, the hatred for religion. These people have none of those traditions. What they see themselves as are martyrs to hatred, martyrs to intolerance, this kind of very generic universalization that really took hold after the Holocaust, in a way and avoid dealing with the Holocaust itself. So every trauma, they resort to the same model, which is completely artificial, but it's meant to create the illusion of solidarity. And afterward, on social media, so many people on the left, the so-called Jewish left, I don't believe they have anything Jewish about them, we're talking about the importance of solidarity. We don't need security, we don't need police, what we need is solidarity. And this has been the universalist refuge of so many Jews on the left, people of Jewish descent on the left, is we need solidarity, and universalizing their experience, making it less Jewish, refusing to address what it actually means, and just trying to say that it is really about solidarity against hate, is what actually gives them a certain amount of false sense of security. The more we universalize it, the more we make it less Jewish, the more we talk about it in generic terms, the more we avoid addressing the specificity of either the Muslim terrorists or of the Jews who were targeted, the more we actually feel a kind of false sense of safety, because we're not standing out as Jews, we are blending in. We have these African-American clergy, we have this lesbian, transgender, Unitarian minister, and we're all together in the solidarity. Yet what they continually discover and yet never learn from is that the solidarity completely falls apart the moment there's actually any specific violence or even any specific anti-Semitism directed from a politically incorrect corner. If a Klansman does something, if somebody on the far right does something, that's fine. All these people will be happy to be in solidarity with them. The moment it goes against their narrative, the anti-Semitism is coming from the left, it's coming from the Black community, it's coming from Muslim terrorists, the solidarity falls away right away, and yet they refuse to learn anything from the experience. They resort once again to the same failed strategy of solidarity, but it's very much also a theological strategy, because this is the theology they've embraced. They've embraced a larger sense of universalizing everything, of being part of this larger meatloaf, this larger challenge for those who are Jewish, in which everybody is diverse, everybody is together in the same boat. There's no specific anti-Semitism, rather there's general intolerance and hatred. And this to them is their meaningful religious experience. They don't process what happened as a religious experience, rather as a political experience, because politics is their religion. So asking them to give up their politics would really be a form of martyrdom. They would prefer to be martyred to their politics than to actually wake up and deal with the reality of it.
See, that's what you're saying. And this is where I think there is a different interpretation, because when the rabbi said that he was asked to go on his knees, and he decided at that moment, if he did that, he would be killed. He knew that was when he would have to do something like throw a chair to distract the guy, and they escaped. So there was, after 11, 12 hours of these negotiations, a moment of violence, a moment of resistance, true resistance, not official resistance from the government, and a moment of rebellion and defiance, which is actually how the situation was resolved. Not by getting on your knees, but by fighting back. And the fact that he actually did that, I think, is why he feels so pained, because in fact, that is exactly what, for instance, Israel has to do to stay in existence. That's what any country, including the United States, has to do. That's what people have to do. They have to defend themselves. And the right to self-defense becomes critical here. And I wonder what you think about that as giving some hope. If they can somehow realize that they cannot have the campaign for nuclear disarmament, ban the bomb, gun control, etc., at the same time that they're throwing chairs at poor homeless Muslims and letting the police kill them.
You know the old joke about a liberal who gets mugged. I don't need to beat that one too much. Bottom line is individuals, people have that kind of moment where they wake up and they realize this is it. I'm about to be killed. I have to do something. I'm sure the rabbi in that case would much rather have talked it out, gotten some other clergy on the phone, and just had this great kumbaya moment where the guy surrenders and realizes these are actually wonderful people. I shouldn't blame the Jews, and I've been brainwashed to think this way. But the moment came when you realize that none of that's going to happen. And once you get on your knees, the guy can actually freely shoot you and probably will. And you know that moment always comes. If I think about September 11th and passengers on all these planes came along, they complied, they thought everything was going to be okay. We'll just do what the hijackers say. They'll negotiate, they'll let us go. Then you have the plane slamming into the World Trade Center. And at that point, there's a line in the sand. People know at this point, we are going to die. They are going to kill us no matter what we do. And they rise up. And, you know, as everybody in that plane who rose up, was everybody in that plane a gung-ho conservative? Was everybody there in the military? Did any of the liberals also rise up? I suspect they would. And I suspect some of these same guys who read in the Washington Post and get outraged about how we treat the people at Gitmo, if they were on the plane now and they understood once again this is happening, planes are crashing into skyscrapers, we're going to be next, they would also rise up. Not all of them, but some of them would. And you know, this is basic human nature. At some point, there's a dividing line, and you have to say, no, this is what I believe is no longer working. This is not a viable strategy anymore. I have to get up off my knees and fight back. But expecting that to happen on a mass level is really hard. September 11th was a wake-up call for a lot of people, but so many people then went back to sleep again. When you're actually faced with a traumatic situation, you may stand up, you may fight back, you may do the right thing, but what do you do a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? That's the real challenge. And as a society, we are very good at getting people to go back to sleep again, at telling them, as we did after September 11th, go back to shopping. That's what you can do for your country. At telling people you don't really have to worry. This was a one-time event. It was an aberrant situation. It's a lone wolf attacker. This is it. You had to deal with the traumatic situation. Now we're moving on beyond that. And the reality is, so many of these events, these trauma therapy sessions, they actually are designed to put people back to sleep so that they don't really process, they don't really deal with what is happening instead of waking up to the reality of it.
So you're more pessimistic than I am that this might be a wake-up call to the Jewish community in the United States. One more question about the Jewish community. I know you've covered a great deal in frontpagemag.com. The ADL statements I read appalled that were all about odd, weird things on Stormfront and right-wing sites and complaining about that, but had absolutely nothing to say, as far as I could tell, about actual Islamic fundamentalist terrorist sites that were devoted to the destruction of America and Israel, and nothing about actual movements that existed, and just called for more training in self-defense. When do you think somebody in the Jewish community is going to say the ADL is endangering the Jewish community by willful blindness against the defamation and physical threats coming from Islamic fundamentalism?
I mean, the ADL was always a broken organization under Greenblatt, Jonathan Greenblatt, an ex-Obama guy. They become much more broken. They really don't have much of a Jewish identity anymore, which is what has happened to a lot of so-called Jewish communal groups, whether it's Hayas, for example, which dropped the Hebrew part entirely. The ADL on paper is supposed to be fighting anti-Semitism. In practice, they've become another member of the coalition of liberal groups. I kind of view them the way some of the Asian groups that are supposed to be fighting anti-Asian hate. In practice, all they do is meaninglessly blame follow political narratives. They blame white supremacy. They don't address the fact that you've got these Black guys that are beating up and assaulting Asian grandmothers. So the ADL is very much in that model. It's based around this being part of this left-wing coalition. They have transgender training. They have gay rights training. They have equities, all the equity stuff. They have all the Black nationalist stuff. This is really what they're interested in because they're part of this coalition as a constituency that derives some of its funding from Jews. They will occasionally say something about anti-Semitism. People will complain. A few of the older donors will call in, and the ADL will make some sort of statement. But this is really not where their heart is at. It's not where their brain is at. And it's a huge change because, as I mentioned, the ADL was always broken. But you go back 25, 30 years under Foxman, and they were at least mentioning Islamist groups. They were addressing, they were tracking some of the anti-Semitic statements by members of Islamist groups, by Islamic clerics. I even use them occasionally as a resource when you go back far enough. They were actually monitoring some of this. Today, there's zero monitoring, there's zero tracking of this. At some point, they'll get around to deleting all this old material. And what they're interested in, of course, is fitting in. And to do that, they have to talk about Islamophobia. They can't talk about Islamic violence and terrorism because then they're Islamophobes. And they're already under a fire from Black nationalists, from various Islamists that demand that nobody participate with them, nobody join in coalitions with them. I recall Eric Holder, when the whole Starbucks thing happened, there was some Black guy was there and somebody asked him to leave and it became a whole movement. Starbucks, in response to Eric Holder and some of these Black nationalists, booted the ADL out because the ADL is not an ally of Black people. So to show they're an ally of Islamists, to show they're an ally of Black people, they have to absolutely sell out their Jewish constituency, and this is what they're doing. This is what they always do, frankly.
That's also rather pessimistic. I'm trying to find some, eternal Jewish optimism, the silver lining to the cloudy. I mean, to me, I would say this is a miracle story that shows, God still works in the world and can save our lives, because I certainly didn't expect such a positive outcome from a hostage crisis. But your view is actually more consistent with what you told me in your interview several years ago, that you felt basically we're facing civilizational collapse. Is that what I should think?
Well, as far as optimism goes, there is reason to be optimistic beyond obviously the religious framework in which, yes, this was a miracle. And we've seen that before. In the California synagogue shooting, you had a miracle that really stopped this from getting much worse, even in Squirrel Hill. So you've had synagogue attacks that were thwarted, and you have quite a few synagogue attacks and attacks on Jewish centers, for example, in, I believe, Kansas City, that completely misfired, which is good news. But beyond the religious framework, obviously, which is vitally important, my source of optimism would not be that the ADL or that the reform community is going to turn around. It's that America is basically, again, across the board, not just the Jewish community, being compressed into polar opposites, which is not in and of itself optimistic, but it means that people who actually understand what's going on have to switch to the other side. It's not enough to just be within a movement that is fundamentally broken and to expect it to just come around, to expect a synagogue shooting to make it rethink everything that it actually believes. That's frankly not going to happen. There is a liberal Jewish dissent movement that is kind of moving somewhat centrist, people like Barry Weiss and so on. But again, that's not really representative of these institutions. And these institutions themselves are very much a function of a Jewish community that no longer exists. So many of these Jewish institutions were created by the old German American Jews, the old German American Jewish establishment that was set up, and they tried to create these parallel institutions in some cases, like the Brit to the Protestant denominations that they wanted to model. This is also where so much of the Jewish liberalism comes from. They set up a lot of these institutions, but the culture that created them is really non-existent anymore. By the time you get to the next generation and the generation after that, these institutions like the ADL will become a farce. They won't represent much of the Jewish community, and there won't be much of a Jewish community for them to represent. There will be a growing traditional Jewish community, and there will be a sizable, I don't know exactly what one would call them, but these are the people who tend to answer none on religious surveys. There's been a huge shift in religiosity in America, which is itself its own huge topic. But for example, for the first time, white Democrats, a majority of them are non-religious. Increasingly, a growing number of American Jews are not religious in any meaningful sense whatsoever. They don't attend any kind of services. Now, when I get asked about Jewish support for leftist causes, one of the things I note is an Obama-era survey, which showed that among Jews who attended synagogue at least once a week, a majority opposed them among those who didn't, the majority supported him. So this is very much a religious division. It's a division in which one side has a kind of theoretical religion, but in practice doesn't really believe in God or the Bible or any of the actual fundamentally unique trappings of Judaism. And that those denominations increasingly are going to disappear. Conservative Judaism, I think, even by its own adherents, is set to disappear within a generation. Reform and Reconstruction would probably blend into some sort of general cultural, but really not religious. I mean, I think even at this point, about 50% of Reform rabbis have said they don't believe in God. So in the survey, so it's going to be a pretty easy transition, and there's going to be a very significant division between those who are traditional and those who are, as a Jew, who oppose Israel, whose politics is very much left-wing politics, but who have no meaningful religious identity, but who insist that they are Jewish in some vague cultural sense. And there's going to be a pretty clear division within America itself, within the Jewish community, within various Christian denominations, of what's right and what's wrong, what actually is sustainable, what's viable, what is a pathway to life, and what is a samamavis in Hebrew, what is a pathway to death. And this is the kind of moments that crystallize that: choose life or choose death.
Well, let's hope that the rabbi of this congregation chooses life as he did in the crisis, and perhaps he can be a model for his fellow co-religionists in the Reform movement to, when finally push comes to shove, to pick up the chair and throw the chair and get the heck out of that situation. I want to thank you again. I know we'll be watching a lot of you on TV, and you're very busy. One of the things you said to me is you were writing a book about the conflict between left and right to avoid the coming civil war. You said that in 2019. Did you ever write that book?
It's a complicated topic. It would certainly be something that would be hopeful. I've been kicking around various ideas, but it's a challenging topic, and it would be even more challenging to find a constituency for it, unfortunately.
Because when you mentioned it, I thought it sounded very far-fetched. But now what I see going on today, I find it, again, sort of prophetic that Pamela Geller said the country is divided into free states and slave states, due to this COVID situation. And you see almost a deliberate splitting of the nation, almost as a tactic, either to break up the United States like Yugoslavia or something like that, or just to foment, divide and rule policies. I mean, it's a very strange period, because I never would have thought this was possible. And I was hoping you were going to say, well, my book's coming out next month, because I remember Michael Savage wrote a book, was How to Stop the Coming Civil War. And I thought that was crazy, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem so crazy anymore. And I was hoping, again, somebody would come up with a solution, an off-ramp to this sort of
How to stop a civil war in 3 easy steps.
Well, you could have 7 steps or 12 steps, I mean, people have those. So, all right. Well, I was hoping for some optimism, but I'm getting realism, which I think is probably a more realistic thing. I just want to say, Greenfield told me in 2019, I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. What I am is realistic, and it's true. And one other quote, which he says his work is guided by George Orwell's statement, "We have now sunk to a depth at which restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men." And I have to say, Daniel Greenfield does a superb job of restating the obvious and is fulfilling his duty as an intelligent man. And I want to thank him for that and his writings and for coming here. And I want to wish him good health and safety and a good year, since we're just starting 2022. And maybe there'll be, Margaret Thatcher once said the only thing certain in politics is the unexpected always happens, right? So maybe something unexpected will happen to turn everything around. All right. Okay, thank you. Good night. I appreciate it.